Let's start off by wetting the paper thoroughly. I'm using a 1-inch modeler brush for this. This is a Princeton Neptune, so it is a synthetic squirrel. Synthetic squirrel brushes hold a lot of water, so it is ideal for something like this and for even clean washes. I wet the paper both horizontally and vertically to make sure I get all of the paper. I then go in with a mix of Andrews turquoise and peacock blue for the sky. I'm trying to keep my movements nice and loose, lifting the paper ever so often just to allow gravity to help produce clean blends. In the part that I left unpainted with blue, I go in and put a gold ochre. I then rinse off my brush and try blending ever so gently, not scrubbing too hard, making sure I don't mix the blue and the yellow too much, producing a green. You have more of a chance of avoiding greens if you use an ochre. I then follow this up with a little touch of orange, just trying to put in a little bit of orange in a circular fashion around the lightest portion, which would be the yellow. And I'm trying to gently blend that out. Once this is done, I drag the wash down. A lower wash of yellow would provide more light to the entire foreground. And while the paper is still wet, I start putting in the greens in the foreground. The color I'm using here is Ward Jeans Dusty Green. It is one of my favorite greens now, and it's from Cheap Joe's American Journey line. All of these paints are from Cheap Joe's American Journey line. All of this is Ward Jeans Dusty Green. This color splits beautifully into a blue and a yellow if you use a lot of water. What I'm trying to do here is aim the viewer's attention to the focal point, which would be the structure that comes in later. But my brush strokes are all pointing towards it, kind of drawing your eyes towards the focal point. What I'm doing now is going back in with a darker green, and for this I'm using earthen green. This is another of my favorite greens. It's a darker, moodier green. I'm still maintaining the same angle of these lines, all drawing your eye towards the focal point. Keep these brush strokes nice and loose. If possible, keep them wider towards the tape and thinner as it moves towards the horizon. This would be easier if you flick inwards. I'm proceeding now to put in a little of the background. There was a hill in the reference, and that's what I'm attempting to put in here. Please notice I haven't re-wet the paper. The paper is still wet from my initial washes. Again, I'm using Ward Jeans Dusty Green, putting in some darker green, which is earthen green. Keeping things nice and loose. I then go in with some raw violet umber. Once this is done, I allow it to dry. The paper is now completely dry, and to paint the structure I go in with a very light wash of gold ochre. You could sketch the structure in if that is easier. I prefer to paint with direct watercolor. It helps me keep things loose. I'm varying up the intensity in parts just to make it look more natural. I'm using a round 6 brush here. I used a round 6 for the foreground as well. I think the brush that I used for the sky was around 10. Just slowly mapping out the structure. I'll add to this in subsequent layers, so it doesn't have to be perfect. The first go can be close to what you want it to be towards the end, but it can be fixed in subsequent stages, so don't worry too much about it. Now I'm adding a darker color. This is raw umber violet. Putting in some darker colors on the top and around the edges just to give this structure some form. Blending it out. And I'm just dragging some of the color down to give the building some more variation. Moving on to adding more form to the little hills in the background. I'm using raw umber violet. You'll see me blending this out soon with clean water, just so it's not sticking out as much. To add some interest, I plop in some distant foliage with the darker green. I'm still using the same dark green I used before. It's earthen green. With what's left on my brush, I put in a little more variations in the little hillock. This doesn't have to look a certain way. I mean, just look at the photo reference and try and approximate as best as you can. You don't have to get all of it perfectly. It's off in the background. You don't want to add too much detail to anything in the background. Now I'm using a mix of earthen green and Payne's grey. Further reinforcing the lines that draw the viewer's eyes to the subject that is the focal point. The focal point in this piece is that little structure, so you want to try and draw the viewer's eyes to it. So all I'm doing here is, bolstering all of the lines that I had before. Those were fuzzier, those were done wet on wet. I'm adding darker colors, wet on dry, to reinforce those lines that I had before. You'll notice that if you do quick brush strokes like that, you get some interesting texture. A little dry brushing. But my mix itself was pretty watery. But as you keep using without reloading, you do get some dry brushing effects. You can see myself picking up some Watt Jeans Dusty Green again, and I'm putting some hills off in the distance. With a rinsed off brush, I blend that in. There was tiny water body in the reference, so I'm trying to mimic that by adding some water here. And this is a mix of Anne Rose Turquoise and Peacock Blue. Just a light, gentle wash. No need to overdo it. This again is raw umber violet. Going back in and darkening some of the edges of the structure. The idea was to still keep the structure looking nice and loose. I'm not going for realism here whatsoever, but it's still nice to introduce some form to the structure. The introduction of shadows really help make the light more obvious. So this is 8 stone, so you want it to have some kind of texture. So without going overboard, try and introduce texture by adding a few darks and blending them out. This is just me trying to fix some of it. Some of it went out of the there weren't any lines to go out of, but it was more than I wanted, so you can just wet that portion, scrub it, and pick it up with a paper towel. I think I've been using this paper towel for a couple of weeks now. You can see there's some ink that got left behind. Yeah, sometimes I take reuse to a very extreme. Trying to put a doorway in. It wasn't sticking too close to the original, but it's nice to give the building some interest. So change things up, but put in some amount of detail. There were steps leading up to the main building, so I'm trying to put in some shadows so you can distinguish steps. I rinsed off my brush and I'm just blending things in a little. Brought my hairdryer out to dry things up so I can speed things up a bit. As you can notice, I've switched down to a smaller brush. This is a round 2. I'm using a mix of raw umber violet and Payne's Grey to put in the shadows. This is a trick I picked up from one of the books that I read. Don't ever fill in windows and doorways fully. Just use quick brush strokes. And then the viewer's eyes and brains will fill in the rest of the details. I'm adding shadows to the stairs with the same color. And also to the structure right on top. You'll notice that the more shadows that you add, your building stops looking flat. And what I'm doing now is just continuing to add shadows. What you cannot see is I'm checking in ever so often with the reference picture, trying to see where the darks are and trying to replicate those closely. Not exactly, but closely. It's a good idea to have a paper towel in hand just in case things get a little more intense than you plan to have them. You can always mop things up. Be careful when reusing a tissue though, because it could leave stains from previous paintings. I tried things off with a hairdryer and I'm going back in and darkening some darks. Shadows are your friend. The more shadows you add, I feel your painting really comes to life. Don't be afraid of the darks. Every time you see me pause, I'm looking at the reference to see what else I need to add. If there are any darks that I'm missing, if things get too intense, then I pick back some of the paint up or try to blend it in so it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. So it's just repeated layers. You add some, you remove some, and you keep going till you're satisfied. I'd noticed in the reference the edges were yellow. So I'm trying to preserve those lighter parts. Right now I'm using some bleed proof white to put some light back in. And now I'm painting the fence in. I'm using a rigger to do this and Payne's Grey. Trying not to paint in every fence post. I'm leaving a few of them out. They're larger near the structure and they're smaller as they move away from the focal point. You could always choose to put in a fence post with a fountain pen or with a dip pen if you prefer to do that and you have more control with that. But I personally love using the rigger brush. The more often you use it, the better your control gets. So maybe practice a little. Darkening some of the fence posts. Again, using paint spray to do that. And I think I put a touch of gold ochre on the side that was facing the light. Using around 6 and some earth and green to put in some splatter, mopping up any of the splatter that falls into the sky. Remember, you can always just cover that portion with a piece of paper and then splatter if you don't want to have to deal with mopping it up. More splatter, but this time with a round 2, and my splatter drops are smaller. Just felt like the doorway could use a little more shadows. And a few more details, so that's what I'm doing here. If I remember right, I probably mopped those things back up, but we'll see. That was some thick gold ochre. Just making the light more intense.